today, inshallah. So if you can just hang around, we're gonna listen to good speech today, inshallah. And then after the speech, we're gonna have dinner for everyone. So please stay after the lecture. Don't leave. We're gonna have some dessert by Knafa Queen, and we're gonna have some food, inshallah. So without further ado, sisters, Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. Is it okay? You can hear? It's okay. Okay, thank you all for making the time tonight. A lot has been happening in Palestine and Palestine, not only the past year, but especially recently. My name is Noura. I'm a member of U.S. Palestinian Community Network. And I've also been a member of the Inland Empire family for a while now. I was born and raised here. So I thank you for making space tonight. With me is my sister, Micheline, who's also a member of USPCN. And today we're going to talk about our duty to Palestine and what that means. And I want to emphasize the word duty and what our role is as a community and as community members to not only each other here, but to the people who are at the front line of Israeli Zionist oppression and occupation, apartheid and ethnic cleansing. But before we start, just some quick housekeeping. Just a heads up, we do have other members here from USPCN, Ali and Karim. So they might be taking pictures of the event. If anybody is not okay with that, let us know. We want to be sure that everyone feels safe and comfortable. As mentioned, food will be served after this, so we'll take about 35 minutes and make sure that you all get to enjoy maklube and knafe. And we also hope that we can engage in conversation rather than it just being a lecture, that you also get a voice in this, because this is your community and it's important that you have a role in how we address our duty to Palestine. So just real quickly, some updates from back home. We've seen several activities in Congress regarding Palestine. HR 2590 is a resolution put forth in Congress for the protection of Palestinian children from Israeli violence. We saw recently the introduction of the two-state solution bill. And we also saw the dramatic unfolding of the additional funding for the Iron Dome. So it's been a turbulent time in Congress when it comes to Palestine, but that's within the privilege of this empire. Back home, we're seeing the people confront Israeli occupation daily. And very recently in Al-Quds, in Al-Aqsa, around Ramadan and Eid, we saw how the Zionists infiltrated and ran into the holy grounds and devastated and violently violated the people who were worshiping. But even now, just within the past few days, we've seen house demolitions around the neighborhoods in Al-Quds. We've seen arrests of women, men, children, and the intentional targeting of people so that they no longer feel safe living in their villages around Al-Quds. We also saw in Lebanon recently the actions of Zionist forces who have a history in supporting Israel and unfortunately had a hand in the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Very recently opened fire on civilians and killed folks, about 7 people, and injured 60. And that's within Lebanon, where we're seeing Zionist normalization occur. We saw today the declaration of civil society organizations, Palestinian spaces that help with human rights violations or aid the people. They were all designated by the defense minister of Israel as terrorist organizations. And perhaps most difficult to talk about are our prisoners, our hunger-striking prisoners. Kayet Fasfous has reached 101 days on hunger strike. Kawasme, 94 days. And several others who are no longer eating or drinking to hopefully achieve freedom because they have been abducted by the Israeli military without any trial or any accusations, but simply for who they are. And I think that's important to note today. There's some obligation that we have, that as we sit here in privilege and in comfort, that there's people who are suffering right now for just their freedom and are not eating in order to achieve freedom. And despite it, when you look at the images of these prisoners, you'll see that they're still trying to speak and smile and bring hope to the people who are outside. And we saw the prisoners who broke free from the Israeli prisons and the joy that they brought to the people and that sacrifice that they made. So while personally it might be difficult, and as we examine this issue of duty, we might feel a sense of guilt and how are we so comfortable while they suffer? But just know that nothing is in vain and we all have a role to play, and that's what we're here to discuss. When it comes to our values as a movement and as a struggle, it's important that there's consensus and that everyone's on the same page. And I pose that to you all here as a community. What are your values in regards to not only Palestine, but in regards to all oppression? Specifically when it comes to Palestine, to Palestine, we believe, and these are our principles, and I always like to start with those values because those are the baseline and those help us define our actions. So what are our values? Liberation from the river to the sea. Palestine, whether it's historical Palestine or Gaza under siege or the West Bank, all of it should be liberated. We believe in the right of return. We should not turn our backs on our refugees, whether they are in the camps within the West Bank or within Gaza or within Lebanon or Jordan, wherever they may be, they should have the right to return to their homeland. And as an occupied people and those facing oppression, the right to resist. No to normalization. Israel itself is not a normal entity. It's not something that should be spoken of with comfort. It's a violent entity and it's not normal. No to normalization, no to colonization, and freedom of all political prisoners. So how do we resist peacefully? What are those things that we can do? Does anyone, and I want to open this up, what are some common ways that folks can engage and do something for Palestine here? What are some things that you've seen perhaps in the past year or so? Awesome, so donations, good. Anything else? Go ahead. Boycott, and we're gonna talk about boycott today. Good job, yeah. Protesting, so organizing and protesting, perfect. Yeah, go ahead. Mm. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you. Is there a comment over here? Yeah. Occupation? We'll talk about that. Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing up your story and sharing that with us. I know it's not easy, and I think it calls exactly what we're trying to say today is what is our duty and what are the things that we're supposed to move towards. So thank you for that. Yeah. Definitely. BDS is a great tool and tactic that we can use, and we'll get into some practice here tonight, hopefully, on how we can start organizing around BDS here specifically. Thank you. Yeah. All good ideas. And hopefully, after this, the space to create more and to collaborate, this should not be a one time thing. I just want to say that. I'm hopeful, inshallah, after this conversation, that as a community, with the masjid being the center of the community, what can it do and what can it do regularly? Now, yeah. I appreciate it. So visibility, community relationships, outreach, education, being an example, all great ideas. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's super valuable is looking for those commonalities. And often we'll find we are in a capitalist society that's going to try to milk every cent out of every community, but do so violently. And so that touches upon some of the tactics. So I appreciate you all sharing. Protesting and organizing is something we do and we see out on the streets. Sometimes we see it, regularly, but oftentimes it's in reaction to something. And that's where we see everybody come out, but then they disappear in between to the next catastrophe. But on your point, that cross community collaboration and understanding that the actions of Israel are the actions of empire and rooted in the US. And those actions, like as we saw in Lebanon, and we see Israel collaborating with a variety of different countries, and that normalization occurring, not just within the Arab region with now Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, but globally. And when we look at the root, we see it compounded with Israel constantly in the center of harm. And I think that's important when we look at the communities here and the priorities. When they passed legislation to fund, to give folks $600 or so for COVID relief, that same moment where they passed that legislation, they went and sent millions to Israel. Why? And if you broke down the numbers, you would find that every Israeli was getting like $900-ish, while every American was getting $600 in COVID relief. So the value on life was not here. And that's very interesting to know as to what are we valuing. So when it comes to that cross-community collaboration, like with USPCN specifically, it's super important that we start looking at the injustices here too. Because if we're not addressing them here, how are we going to turn around and address Palestine or anywhere else in the world? We have an obligation to the black community, the injustices that they face. We have an obligation. This area in the Inland Empire is stolen land. We see the reservations all around us and the casinos. This is stolen land that we're on. Do we address that? Do we talk about it? Do we acknowledge that here today? And understanding the continued harm that these communities face. As Muslimin, what is our role in addressing that injustice? Or do we pretend like it's not occurring? For me, as a Palestinian, I look at that and I think, is this gonna be us in 100 years? We're an afterthought. And I'd like to think no. Because in those instances where we show up for the black community or the indigenous community or the Chicanx community, they've shown up for us consistently. And in our college years, when multiple wars went off, I recall the Chicanx community surrounding us during Salat al-Jum'ah to protect us so we wouldn't be fearful of anybody attacking us. There was that common understanding that we have each other's backs. But it comes back to those principles and how we define it. And then from there we build the duty, and that's where we're getting all these ideas on what do those actions look like. So we can't necessarily say, okay, Palestine is this week and whatever is this week, Sudan is this week, and there's a common thread here that our people are under attack as colonized people. And being here in the belly of the beast of imperialism, what then is our role? How do we combat this? And BDS came up. And just to prop up this topic of BDS and what it is, it's super important that we define normalization. And we hear the term normalization when it comes to how do we engage or how do we discuss or how do we avoid interacting with anything Zionist or Israeli. But if you take the theme of normalization, you could very well extend it to any kind of harmful entity. In this particular case, Normalization is endorsing or collaborating with any individual or entity that carries, represents, or invokes Israeli aspirations or sentiments. Now, if we take that and you just switch the name Israeli and you put the whatever oppressive source it is, you'll notice that we all then can stop normalizing any kind of oppression. But the problem and the reason why we see selection is because sometimes we do it with this community and sometimes we don't do it with that. So we have to stay consistent on our principles and our duties, right? Sure. Yeah, تفضلي. Yeah. 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 No, no, no sorries. You're good. No, thank you. I appreciate it. You don't have to say sorry. These are all like very valid truths. And again, go in hand with the need to mobilize, to consolidate resources, to create visibility, and to organize. And it comes down to that point of being reactionary. We wait for a catastrophe to happen. Everyone gets emotional and into it. But what happens in between? And where is the consistency? And I do want to say, there's many who do put forth an effort, but there's so many obstacles: censorship, policing. We've seen assassinations, we've seen investigations. So much happens here that they try to scare us from doing the right thing. So folks definitely do try, but the probably one of the biggest obstacles is keeping the momentum going, despite the fear tactics that the state or the entities impose on us. But to continue forward, just to jump into BDS, because I want to make sure you all get a chance to eat on time. If we look at what normalization is, and if we're trying to resist normalization, that is making Israel a common entity that's normal, then BDS is that economic action that we can take to create for alternatives, so that we're not buying into the normalizing of Zionism. BDS is not a new concept. We'll get into the definition of it a little bit, but for some history, boycotting is rooted in the civil rights movement here. They, with the black community and their boycotts of buses and to dismantle segregation in the South, they boycotted. In the Intifada, the first Intifada in Palestine, they actively boycotted Israeli goods. And to find a alternative, they started to create their own goods. They recognized the economic power that buying into this entity does. And so this is not something new. This is, if the Intifada was in the mid-'80s or late '80s, we're talking 40 years ago. And this was done on the ground. And there was no big giant organization that said, hey, boycott this, or this is how you should do it. And I challenge you all, and I think that's one obstacle here, is we always wait for some large entity, something with a big social media following and, well-known brand name organization to come and tell us what to do. But I say all of you have the power within you to determine what that action should be, and not to wait for it to be trickled down. But really it comes down to, are we taking the steps? Are we coming together as a community? Are we talking about the impact of certain events on community members and how we're going to address this? And how are we going to be consistent in how we address it? So without further ado, I do want to jump into BDS just a bit. Just also keeping in mind the roots of Zionism itself being an economic entity. Now, oftentimes, it gets manipulated into this religious movement, but it came out of secularism, it came out of colonialism. And if you look at the founding documents of Zionism itself from Theodor Herzl, he talks about a company, he talks about a charter, he talks about how much money to invest in this, how it's going to be protected, what banks to use in London. The terminology is so much so that it's not necessarily about identity per se, but more so how do we secure our resources and how do we allocate that into this new state. And this is written far before the creation of Israel. We're talking about early 1900s. But the framework and the theory was there. And that's why I think BDS is especially important to mention when we're talking economics, is Zionism itself has economic roots to it and how it sustains itself. And we see that play out today. We see the usage of nonprofits here, some based in Orange County doing fundraising for illegal settlements. They call themselves nonprofits. They're 501c3s. They're legal, but they're funding the theft of Palestinian land, and not only that, the training of its military. That's pretty scary that they have this clear pipeline that they're able to navigate money from here to there. And so Rashida Tlaib put out a letter calling on the US government to investigate these organizations. How are they funding illegal settlements so easily and transparently? And yet today we have the defense minister of Israel attacking Palestinian human rights organizations that just do services and help people out. So there's a privilege and an elitism and a supremacy rooted in Zionism. Zionism itself coming from Europe. Zionism itself being white. Zionism itself preying on the people of not only Palestine, but going so far as to target the entire region, and not only that, to stipulate what its role is going to be here in the US, in Europe, and globally. So this is a well thought out ideology and system that we're talking about here. And so yes, it could be daunting to think, it's been, so many years and we're not getting any closer to liberation. But the fact that we're still talking about it, the fact that we have these narratives being shared, That's a sign of hope. And sometimes the most we can do is to ensure, my daughter's here and there's many youth here, that they continue the movement forward. So with BDS, we can do that. Uh, and I'll pass it on to Micheline to introduce BDS and go over some details. In the meantime, we'll pass around some handouts, and those give you an idea of companies that, me too, I mean, living here to a certain degree, you are normalizing Israel economically. But on this document, you'll see some household brands that support Israel. And I want to challenge you all to take a look, and we'll go over it towards the end, but really look at that sheet and look at how normal Israel is in our purchasing and what alternatives we can come up with. And maybe not today, but eventually, this space here can agree we want to target this company and not purchase it anymore. And here's an alternative. If we can do that here in this masjid, I assure you others will follow and the momentum will grow. Yeah, we'll talk about how they support.
All right. So the BDS movement, it's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So boycott is putting pressure through non-cooperation, including academic, cultural, sports, and products consumer boycott. And then divestment is withdrawing investment from corporations that profit from unjust practices. And this could be done in universities, churches, mosques, and unions. And then sanctions, economic and diplomatic restrictions imposed by governments. And then the goals of the BDS is ending Israeli occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. Recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and practicing, protecting, and promoting the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and prosperities as speculated in UN Resolution 194.
So one of the big pieces of misinformation, BDS gets manipulated by Zionists, by liberal Zionists, and they'll say BDS is okay if we only target the products that come out of illegal Israeli settlements. BDS in its creation and its design targets all products that come from any space, any point of Israel itself. It's not just limited to illegal settlements. Does anyone want to take a shot as to why that might be the case? Why is it being manipulated? It's a trick, it's a deeper question, it's an analytical question here. Sometimes it's easier for the Zionist or the enemy, let's say, to buy into the tools and the tactics of those that are oppressed. So right now you'll see, sorry, I hear some chitter chatter. Sometimes you'll see that Zionists will call themselves indigenous and native to the land. Sometimes you'll see them promote BDS because they want to secure Israel proper and forego the illegal settlements, so they'll support BDS. So be very careful when you look at social media and news articles as to why an entity might be pro-BDS. If they're doing it because they want to secure Tel Aviv but forego Sago settlement, that's not okay with the original design of BDS. BDS targets all of Israel. And a lot of people are shocked by that here in the US. Back home, that's common knowledge. But here, they're very shocked by that because they've been told, oh, just illegal settlements. Israel proper has been normalized. It's just the illegal settlements that are an issue now, which is contrary to our principles. So we passed around a worksheet, and I just want to ask some questions. Does anyone know any active BDS campaigns? Or heard of anything locally being done for BDS? That's really interesting, just coming from like an alumni space, is that they carry economic power as donors to reverse whatever the students organize and put through. Thank you for that. There's also something called Block the Boat. Did anyone hear about that BDS endeavor? Block the Boat, that happened out of the Los Angeles port in Long Beach, actually. No? Okay. Do you want to share about Block the Boat? Okay. Yeah. You're on fire. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So this economic power, the ability to disrupt the typical economic activities of Israel, is super powerful. So people were organizing to stop this boat from docking, and as a result, they were losing money, but also the assurance of their clients if they can put their cargo on these boats. So it creates a ripple effect. Now, why was Zim, the container company, the shipping company, targeted? One, it's based in Israel, but number two, it's helped relocate folks to as settlers to move to Palestine and steal land. Three, it ships military defense items. So this is a very compounded target. Now notice there's justifications when it comes to why we target something for BDS. It takes a little bit of research. On this worksheet I gave on the bottom is a link so that you can look up all kinds of different products and companies that engage with Israel in some way. But ultimately, if you're going to design a BDS action here, and I really hope that we can hear that this masjid did this, and we're more than happy to support and help guide towards this. But you want to, number one, figure out the moral legitimacy of why this particular entity or business or organization should be targeted, and doing that research. Number two, how are you going to educate the public? So again, it's that community outreach piece, it's that transparency, it's creating materials, it's doing the research, it's being able to talk about these things. Number three, what are the goals? That's another problem. We say, oh, free Palestine. Okay, what are the steps? What are the little goals that we have to take to reach that? So creating goals when it comes to your BDS action. Having a clear plan helps. It's very easy to say, oh, for a while, I think when I was in college, like Starbucks was a no-no. Everyone said, don't go to Starbucks. Like, no, it supports Israel. The why was very unclear. The how was very unclear. It wasn't sustainable. I mean, I will not ask you all to raise your hands, but I would not be shocked by the amount who went to Starbucks today. So the education piece is there, but also the actions. And when it comes to actions, thinking about how are we going to educate our own community, how are we going to educate the external community? What are ways in which we can avoid purchasing this? Does our space purchase goods that violate BDS? Have we looked at that? Have we looked at our suppliers? What alternatives can we come up with? And maybe that's a good business opportunity somewhere. Let's support our own community and their own services and products. So giving this kind of platform to a BDS action will help anchor it locally. One of sabra, hummus is a popular one for people to do, and they focus on it because you also want to look at, is this a luxury? Is this something we need? Is this something we depend on? It's okay for us to admit that because we're in the belly of the beast, it's hard to forego those essentials. So for example, one of the vaccines, Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is a supporter of Israel, big time. Very much Zionist. Now, can I come and say, hey, nobody take Johnson & Johnson? Not necessarily. That's not a luxury. But having sabra hummus is a luxury. We don't have to purchase that. So give yourself the benefit too, and the kindness to yourself to think, okay, what are the easy things that I can do away with? What are the things I don't need? Where are there substitutes for it? And when you present it like that to the community, it becomes easy. It also builds a culture around people going out. We are in America. America's run by the economy more so than it is about any principles or values on human life. Going out and making smart purchases and going into the mall or going into the grocery store and saying, and really looking at it and saying, is this good for me, the whole me, not just health-wise, but also does it support some kind of crime somewhere in the world? And if we get into that mindset and we train our children to do that, it'll become second nature. You know, people back home, they look at the barcode. And you might see that here sometimes, 729 on the code that they scan when you purchase an item. That'll tell you if it came straight from Israel or not. There's also an app now where you can scan a barcode and it'll tell you where it was made and if it's Israeli. Yeah. Definitely. And that brings to mind for me Ben and Jerry's. Does anyone have any comments? Did anyone hear about what happened with Ben and Jerry's? The ice cream? Do you want to share? No? Anyone? Yeah, go ahead. They won't sell to Israel? Okay. Almost. Anyone want to add to that?
They refused to, Israeli basically refused to buy a Ben Jerry, boycott, in reverse, boycott. And Ben Jerry took a very ethical stand that we're not going to have anything to do with the, indigenous people, so that's what, and we all support, Muslims went buy more Ben Jerry.
True, yes. Anything else on Ben and Jerry's? Thank you. There you go. Yes, there's the key word, only in settlements. Remember, I hinted at it earlier. Be very careful of how we look at BDS and how it's manipulated. So in the case of Ben and Jerry's is not for BDS or is not necessarily pro-Palestinian life. They were pushed to not necessarily engage in Israeli illegal settlements, but they're still able to sell wherever they want. And in fact, they had a reactionary statement where they're like, no, this is not, we're not trying to empower BDS. But some people saw this as an opportunity and said, okay, let's run with Ben and Jerry's because it fits the narrative of targeting illegal Israeli settlements, but it doesn't target the whole of Israel. And we have to be very careful of that here because immediately graphics came out on social media and people were all for Ben and Jerry's and buying it in bulk. Politicians were normalizing it. There's a whole, marketing department behind that, but it didn't necessarily align with BDS. Remember that one of the main principles of BDS is anything sourced out of Israel. And they made a very clear statement to say, we are not against Israel. So that's very, it's an interesting insight and something to keep in mind as we start to identify possible companies or entities that we want to target. So just to wrap up real quick, this worksheet, I'm hopeful maybe as a community we can come back together and take a look and think, and it might not be any of this, and I don't want this to overwhelm you all, but really look at the things here and say, what here is a luxury? What do I don't need anyways and I could live without? And think about it and maybe come to a consensus as a community as to how we could potentially replace them, what education we can do around them, what ways we can engage. There might be business owners here, there might be people who are decision makers in their organizations. What are some active steps we can take to safeguard Palestinian life and human rights, and not promote doing business and normalizing the Zionist entity. And slowly but surely, if there's consensus as to what we can do here, it'll root itself and it'll become normal for us. But it's those initial steps and that dedication, yeah.
So quick question, I see Honda. So just for education myself, what's the relationship with this?
So there are so many companies here that that's why that link is on the bottom. There's hundreds. So I can't speak specifically to Honda, but Israel, and right now we're seeing a heightened interest in BDS towards technology and the creation of certain GPS and all of that. So that's becoming a big trend with the campaigns that are being made when it comes to BDS. I'm assuming there's some piece of technology with Israel having a very strong technology partnership with Silicon Valley and manufacturers and designers here. That's my assumption, but if that's the case, and that's where that research and that education comes in. But good question. What is? What was that? Chobani? Is it on here? I mean, I can't speak to why or what they do, but I mean, we see a lot of Muslims doing business with Israel these days, unfortunately. Yeah, right here.
So they list houses that are from the West Bank and in the settlements. So they're listing houses in the legal settlements and houses that have been stolen in the West Bank on Airbnb. And did you explain to him what BDS? Okay.
Yeah, so you bring up a really sensitive one. That one was like very working with the Afghan community and my friends and seeing that as an option. In that instance, it was hard for me personally because it's like I know Airbnb operates out of illegal settlements, but I also know that they're going to provide this service for relocating Afghan refugees. And that's kind of the trust. I'll speak as an individual, like the trust I have in my friends who are organizing some of that. Like I trust them and I know that, okay, this isn't a luxury right now, it's a need, right? So always come back to that. Is this a luxury here or is it something that we need? At the same time, even if it's something that we're dependent on, maybe think, okay, within our community, how can we cultivate resources here? Like how can we think of things that we have available so we can start to replace this so nobody's hurt? It takes time and it takes effort and it takes dedication to figure that out. So for example, with the Afghan community, I know they were putting out calls for, hey, can you open up your home to help people? Like as an alternative to this. This is a conversation that happened. And so people started opening up their homes so that we wouldn't have to rely on Airbnb. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that question. No, thank you for that. Yeah, that research and finding those umbrella companies can help identify those individual brands. Thank you. Any other questions or points or storytelling before we wrap up? Yeah.
Is there any TV channel or any other big media organizations to talk about things that you are talking for a small community like this? Any TV? Just one second. I give you guys credit, alhamdulillah. I don't know how you guys gather so many youths in here. We know about this Israel. When I was a teenager, I protested. I'm from Afghanistan. We protested strong in Kabul against the occupation. About the 1967 invasion. We know, but these kids growing in here, they may not know, but good for you guys, alhamdulillah. Make it more, so they know more, and then they outreach like you, so we get stronger.
Inshallah. Thank you.
So, to the brother, speak about the Prime Minister. Israel, for my sake, we give our life. That's why we give more priority to Israel. I'm from Afghanistan, but I give more priority to Israel. Islam doesn't know no boundaries. Doesn't matter if you're from Afghanistan or not. So that's the answer. You're right, but you should give more priority to Israel. And because of that.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you. On the question of media sources, does anyone know of any good media sources to get better information, accurate information, and information that centers, Palestinian voices or comes from the perspective of the oppressed?
Fox News.
Fox News, yeah.
That's a gift. But do we have anything from us side?
Mm-hmm.
And we are.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point on the role of social media, right? It's like, especially during the uprisings, most recently in the Unity Intifada, a lot of people took to their Instagrams and went live to report what was happening on the ground. And the Israeli military would try to grab their phones and smash it because now there was no gatekeeper as to how reporting would be due. The people took it in their own hands to do that reporting. So that's a good account. Any other? Yeah. Democracy Now? Okay, cool. Why? Nice. Yeah. I appreciate that, and the point on censoring voices at the front line. That's excellent. Thank you. Any other sources of media we can share? Yes. Ground 4. Which one's Kate? Okay. And it's very good to look at local news and how they're depicting, our community here locally, and to see this is what public media is saying about us or about these situations, because that's the media that the outside, the people in these streets see. So if we're able to look at that media and assess and say, okay, if this is the narrative that they're getting fed, this is what we have to do to also show our truth and do that outreach that you were talking about. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Do you have anyone in mind that you share? The Kurd twins are great to see for events in throughout the West, mostly Al-Quds and maybe Ramallah area. Yeah. Okay. Any other? There's Counterpunch. Any other sources? Maybe that's some follow-up work we can do, is like media training and where to seek information. Al Jazeera. One, yeah. Why? It seems all right, right? It's a good start, yeah. AJ Plus is awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So we also have local organizations like CARE and MPAT, and they're very active for the Palestinian cause, and they really, portray, and they have very resources to educate or create awareness just in the U.S. And I see a lot of new, the story about the Israeli and Palestinian. I see the Americans are shifting their just the thought process, because they used to blindly support Israel, but now you can see that with all the education, with all the efforts, I see that the opinion has been shifting, even towards because they want to have two-state solution. They want to have peace. Because even my neighbors I talk to now, they are more aware, and they say yes, this has to be resolved sooner than later.
Right, right. Yeah, that narrative is definitely shifting. You bring up a good point as to local resources. And I think as a community, identifying where you can go to get information, resources. Somebody brought up fundraising too, or donations, knowing where you can do that and it reaches the people directly. We actually passed out, I don't know if everybody checked in at the front, but we have a brochure and some information as to how you can get involved. And I encourage you all to get involved, but to also examine, different organizations that might fit, what you're looking for. Yeah. Google? There's a ton missing here. There's hundreds missing here, but yes. Tell me about Google. So censorship. Yes.
TikTok too.
TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
All of it.
For some reason, I can't hear. I'm so sorry. Really? Wow. Good work. Cool. I think that's it. We'll be around. We'll hang around for any additional questions or information. I'm really thankful that this wasn't just a lecture, but more so all of you shared out. And hopefully we can have future spaces like this and come out with some actions, or at least at the very core, understanding what our duty is and the values that reinforce that duty, so that we can stay consistent and not only serve the oppressed people in Palestine, but especially the indigenous, the black community here, the Latinx community, and finding those common grounds with others who are facing the same oppression. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum.
Just a reminder, we have our table outside if you did not sign in.